Okay, great. So we're recording is starting now. It seems like the source sheet is being shared. It doesn't need to be shared right now. So welcome. I was just saying, I'm Lori Novick, director and head writer of Deracha.org and a Yoetzet Halacha. And it's a pleasure today for me to be joined by my colleague, newly appointed director of digital content for Deracha, Ora Ziering, who's also Yoetzet Halacha. And today we're going to be talking about Shelo Asani Isha and Kisha Asani Kirtzono. We're first going to learn a little bit about them, and then we're going to use them as a springboard for looking at different approaches in the classroom for teaching this type of sensitive topic, utilizing and leveraging the resources that are available on the Deracha website. So we're so glad that you can all join us today, those of you who are here with us live, and we're delighted for those of you to be with us in recording who are going to be hearing this a little later. So like I said, I want to start with just sort of like a mini shear to make sure that we're all up to speed and on the same page about the topic. And then we'll move forward into Ora's presentation of some different ways to teach this in the classroom. Okay, so getting started, there's a source sheet that should be available if you look under the box on your page. It should be available there as an attachment. Please write in chat if you have any trouble seeing it. So just some basic sources, some fundamental aspects of this topic. To start with, we have a Gemara in Yevamos. We have a Gemara in Menachos, in which Rabbi Meir, who's a Tana, said, Rabbi Meir Zatana said, "Chayav adam levarech shalosh brachot b'chol yom Elohen." A person is obligated to recite 3 brachot every day, and these are they: Shelo asani goy, Shelo asani isha, Shelo asani bor. Thanking God, blessing God, who has not made me a non-Jew, who has not made me a woman, and who has not made me a bore, someone who's highly ignorant, unschooled, not developed in thinking. Now, what's interesting here actually is the context in which Rabbi Meir says this, which come up a little later. So Rabbi Meir is actually also in the same place in the Gemara. He's also talking about an obligation that he perceives for a person to recite 100 brachot a day. So these 3 brachot, it would seem, are part of a person's ability to fill out the 100 brachot a day. And the question is, why did these 3 come up? And interestingly enough, the Tosefta gives rationales for each of them. Now, the Tosefta, when it talks about the goy bracha and the bor bracha, talk about sort of their status. But when it talks about the woman bracha, says something a little different. Isha she'ena nashim chayavot b'mitzvot. A woman, shelo asani isha, that bracha is being said because women are not obligated in mitzvahs. Now, obviously, the Tosefta doesn't think that women are not obligated in any mitzvahs. What it means is women are not obligated in all the mitzvahs that men are obligated in. Namely, in particular, we always think most prominently of the category of mitzvahs such as man grama. If we put these things together, we still have this kind of curious thing, which seems a little foreign to our ears, which is, well, why does this have to be said in the negative? I mean, nowadays, when we talk about things, I think I like to think, and we know that Chazal were very careful about speech and language, but to our modern ears, to phrase this in the negative, who didn't make me a non-Jew, who didn't make me a slave, who didn't make me a woman, can sound a little rough. So why does this have to be phrased in the negative? Bach says something interesting. He says, look, if it were phrased in the positive, and a man started out his set of brachos by saying, instead of saying Shelo asani goy, by saying Shasani Yisrael, who may be an Israelite, in saying Shasani Yisrael, he's already implying that he's a free man and that he's not a woman because he's using the masculine and not the feminine in reciting that bracha. So it might be that one of the reasons why these brachas are phrased in the negative is because that helps build you up to 100 brachas a day. There's another way to think about it as well. It appears that in ancient times, there were certain parallels to the identity brachas in other cultures, and that phrasing in the negative didn't have the same kind of connotation that it does now. But that was actually a kind of classic standard way to express or to make a statement about one's identity. So those are possibilities. We can't really know for sure. And then what's interesting is the Gemara's more meaty discussion about this topic starts to sort of explore what things are about. And it starts from the question of, well, what's the Shelo asani bor? And in fact, nowadays, no one says Shelo asani bor. Or generally speaking, one doesn't say Shelo asani bor. The sequence is Shelo asani goy, Shelo asani eved, and for a man, Shelo asani isha. And we'll talk about a woman's bracha in a moment. And the Gemara kind of plays with this. There's a story about Rav Acha who hears his son say the bracha of Shelo asani bor and objects to it. The Gemara doesn't tell us why he objects to it. And then the son says, well, so what am I supposed to say instead? Shelo asani eved, but how is that different from Shelo asani isha? And his father says to him, yeah, say shelo asani ish, say shelo asani eved. And the phrase he uses for say shelo asani eved is ziltfe. And ziltfe, Rashi gives two different explanations for what it means, each of which leads to a different way of understanding what the bracha is about. First explanation of ziltfe is this is sort of on a lower rung socially. In other words, we could look at these brachas as expressing something about social status, in which case maybe we would say that shalos ani isha, shalos ani eved are different rungs of social status. A woman's social status being higher than that of an eved, but presumably, if we understand these brachas that way, lower than that of a man. That's one suggestion that Rashi makes. The second suggestion that Rashi makes is that ziltfe means going at it. And then Rashi adds, when he's talking about it, the idea that this is connected to, or that the supposition that woman and slave or bondsman would be have the similar meaning, according to Rav Acha bar Yaakov's son, is based on the idea that they share an exemption in mitzvot aseh zman grama, positive time-bound commandments. So in that case, really, that second explanation of Rashi's makes a lot of sense because it really lines up well with the Tosefta, and I should add also with Yerushalmi. So even though there is this explanation that shows up in Rashi and in some other significant Torah figures that says that what's going on with these brachas is a statement about social status, the most well-founded and established explanation is that these brachas, the man reciting the bracha of Shelo Asani Isha, is effectively giving thanks for being obligated in more mitzvahs than a woman is. And that's exactly the explanation that's also given by the Torah. He says this explicitly. And what's really difficult to understand is how we can kind of work with this language when it's so easy to sort of jump to a conclusion that it means something that it doesn't. In other words, these aren't just apologetics that I'm pulling out of a hat. I mean, this is the Tosefta, this is Yerushalmi, this is how Rashi explains the Gemara in one of his explanations, which lines up with those other sources. This is the Torah. I mean, this is a really well-established explanation for it. And yet the bracha sometimes is said in a different way, or it seems to be said in a different way, or the experience of hearing the bracha can be more complicated. My Rebbe, Rav Yehuda Henkin, expressed real regret about this. He said, I think everyone would feel better about these brachas if everyone was confident all the time that any man saying this bracha just had in mind that he's grateful for being obligated in mitzvot setzeh zman grama. So it's an interesting thing. And actually, there's even a record of Yisachar Tamar, and the LA Tamar brings a story that occurred, he says occurred in the 19th century about a Hasidisha, a woman who was the wife of, daughter of, sister of important Hasidisha Rabbanim who complains about the bracha. In other words, the idea that it's a little challenging sometimes to hear this bracha is not something that's just some new feminist concept. It's something that also we see goes a while back. And in fact, Rav Chaim David Halevi, who's chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, suggested in his practical halachic compendium, Makor Chaim, that when men say the bracha, they specifically need to have kavana before they say it. They need to take time and stop and have kavana for the obligation in positive mitzvot that are time bound. And additionally, that when they do that, they have to keep in mind, well, this is actually a point made by Rav Shamshon Rapha Hirsch. They have to keep in mind that this isn't just a statement of being grateful for the obligation, but it's also a statement of recognizing what that means, that obligation, or you could, in modern terms, you might call it that privilege, that privileged position that men find themselves in to have this obligation brings with it a whole level of responsibility in the world of Torah and mitzvot. Next question that comes up a lot is the question of if the bracha can change. And it's a dicey question. It's a dicey question because playing around with brachas that show up verbatim in the Talmud and that have been codified in all the major halachic codes is not something that we can do too easily. Sometimes there's room for there to be an adjustment in the language of a bracha as long as the meaning of the bracha is maintained. This one's a toughie because anything that we'd want to do in theory even to try to adjust the language of the bracha might in fact wind up adjusting its meaning. Part of the problem is because the language of the bracha doesn't clearly signify the meaning the way that we might like it to. So it's not a simple thing to go ahead and just change the bracha. This is the case even though there are some records in earlier eras of brachas being made in positive language. Some of that, like you have printed in the Talmud, it says Shasani Yisrael, and that's pretty clearly a response to the censor. It's really an existential threat. So we're not in a case of existential threat right now. No one's threatening our lives for saying a bracha about Shelo Asani Goy, for example. And the other time is there's some early prayer books from Italy that have positive language, and it's kind of hard to know what the provenance was, and it wasn't widely picked up. So it's another issue that comes up, and it could be that someday there would be some sort of rabbinic consensus that there could be some alternate language for this bracha, but we're not there yet. One last point that I want to bring up is the bracha of She'asani Kirtzono. This is actually a really interesting one because it doesn't show up in the Gemara. Usually it's not so simple either for us to make brachas that aren't rooted in the Gemara. It shows up in Gaonic times, and in fact, there are many halachic authorities, predominantly in the Sephardi world, who suggest reciting the bracha of She'asani Kirtzono without Shem and Malchut. Women who follow those rulings often follow other rulings limiting women reciting brachot, so it's not as jarring to have that difference. But on the whole, there's no indication, let's say in the Shulchan Aruch, there's no indication in the Torah that this is unlike other brachas, even though it stems from Gaonic times. The Torah actually says that nagu anashim, that women had the custom of saying it or became accustomed to say it. It sounds like this might have really been a grassroots bracha that women started to say, of women's own initiative, that gets picked up and supported by the rabbinic establishment, which is itself really interesting and special phenomenon. Last point about this, or two last points about this. Number one is, how are we supposed to understand the bracha? There are two major paths of understanding it. First path of understanding it, which is suggested by the Torah and others, is that this is sort of a woman, again, responding to the idea that women are not obligated in all the mitzvot that men are, that this might be a moment during the day where a woman expresses that she accepts it. It's tough. It's a tough thing not to be obligated in all the mitzvahs. And this is a moment where a woman both says, I recognize that and I accept it. That's one possibility. A second possibility is that this is a positive expression of thanks for being what a woman is, that a woman has the opportunity to thank God for making her a woman in positive language. There's a great quote we brought on the site by Dr. Erica Brown, which I love. And it really leads into a broader question, which is how much room there is for a woman to fill this particular bracha with a lot of her own kavanot, because it's potentially very, very spiritually rich for a woman to recite a bracha of She'asani Kirtzono, very self-accepting, very empowering to stand before God and say, as you made me is something that I'm grateful for. And that I bless you for. And so this bracha, rather than being sort of like a condolence prize, in some sense might be a challenge, because it can be rooted or connected to a difference between men and women's mitzvah obligations. And in another sense can really be a very, very beautiful moment in a woman's tefillah. I'm going to share that for me personally. It's a bracha that I actually have always felt wonderful saying. I know not everyone feels that way, but it's always been something I really connect to. Okay, Ad Khan, up till now, that was sort of the mini shir to get us all more or less up to speed on the basics about this issue, at least as we presented it on the Durachas site. Now I turn the floor over to my colleague, Yoetzet Halacha Ora Ziering, to share with us some different approaches to educating on this issue. For this, I think we need a moderator. If you could put up the slideshow, it would be great. And we're going to look at 3 different approaches for teaching this in a high school classroom.
Okay, so we're going to look at 3 different, can I control it?
Yeah, I think
One second. Yes, proceed. Okay, so we're going to look at 3 different approaches for teaching this topic. So we titled them, I tried to get a little bit of fun here, starting backwards, finishing the puzzle, and bringing it home. So just before we start, each of these parts of each of these modes are not necessarily meant to be used alone. Like, you all know your classes, and you can decide which class needs to start here and end here, or take a little tip from the middle one. So they all have their own interesting, chap to them, and you can, as your teachers and knowing your classes and knowing different classes, you can use them in different ways. Okay, so our first approach is starting backwards. So I kind of geared it towards maybe like a 9th grade, or kind of 10 to 12 that have weaker skill level, weaker tech skills. This is actually something I love to do in halacha all the time, which is do the opposite, I think, of what I think I did when I learned, which is usually you start with the psukim and the Gemara, and you work your way through all the sources, and you end with kind of the fun questions. I always think back when I was in the Yoetz Halacha program. My favorite part when I did Chazara was always the Pischei Tshuva, which is the end, and it had like the funnest, like it was, you would go through all the text and and do all the hard work, and then you get to the fun part. And the Pischei Tshuva, you bring a couple of tshuva with really fun questions, and you get to apply all the knowledge. I think when you have students with weaker tech skills, I think what happens often is if you start off with the Gemaras and you kind of try to get them through Rishonim, a lot of time you'll lose them because they're going to be so stuck just trying to get the basics. And a really good way to kind of link them in and get them involved is to start backwards, which is by starting with the really good question and the fun question that engages them. And when you start backwards, you kind of start with the question and then decide, depending again on your class and what you think they need and what they can handle, which sources you're going to bring in that are going to help them understand the question and the answer that's given to the question. So they will, and so what's really special and what you're going to see when we move on in the slideshow is that on Darchaha, they actually have each article, and you'll see in this article has a question and answer section, which you'll see in a minute, which allows you as the teacher to say, hey, we're going to learn this topic, but we can start backwards using something that's totally connected and meant to be connected with this article.
What's actually really fun about you saying that is, in fact, when we conceived of the site, and still to this day when we write material for the site, like the way we think of those open and closed questions in the middle of answers, and also that independent tab in the kind of like the article pages on content pages, is like, this is the moment where we think the student would ask this question in class. Like that really was like the way we were thinking about it, was this is the question the student's really going to have. So it's perfect that in this lesson plan, that's how we're starting.
Right. So, and you'll see also the answers that are given aren't always just halachic answers. They're also going to touch on the hashkafic ideas, which are, by the way, what will probably come up in class in your class discussion anyway. So you're just kind of flipping the class around, which by hoping to engage students who won't necessarily be engaged otherwise, and also would have a harder time starting the other way. So the students, you'll see, will read the question and answer on the topic, and we're going to tie it back to original sources, and you are going to be, learning approaches to understand these brachot and their implications. So let's take a look at the site. So this is the example of the Darchaha site, and as you can see, right, there's a bunch of different tabs, right? You have the in brief, in depth, the sources, the question answers, and the podcast. So in this particular mode of teaching, we would obviously start with question and answers. All right, so you go to the question and answers. Next, and then you can take a look, and each one has a bunch of question and answers, and you can see that there are actually two types of question and answers, right? There are the hashkafic question and answers, which were basically written for the actual articles, and then there are reader question and answers, which are things that people have written in that might be connected to the article. Which, by the way, I had this fun idea when I was working on this project, is that one of the things you can do as teachers is actually try to get your students to writing questions and see it.
We've had that happen. We've had students write.
Exactly.
And you can get from their classroom.
Right. And so they'll actually feel like really responded to. So if there's a question that comes up in your discussion, you can actually get them to write it in, and it will hopefully be addressed. So you get to choose. So you look down the tabs and you choose answer. Did you want to add something?
No, I think we could just read, for example, the ones that come up in this topic. So it's like in this topic, it's why are the identity brachot phrased in the negative? How can we address Shelo Asani Isha? How should we understand Shasani Kirtzono? Which are really getting to the core of the types of questions I think that are going to trouble students. Of course, there can always be other things, but it's a good start.
Right, and it's a good way to get them engaged. Right, so then we have our next step. So we read the questions and prepare topics for discussion. Right, so I chose two. Right, how should we? I can't see from here.
How can we understand the bracha of Shasani Kirtzono?
Right. So then you add some questions to discussion, right? So which understanding of the bracha sits best with you and why, right? So start off your class and read the question together and have a bit of a discussion, right? And that's step one. But it's not the end because, right, we don't want them just to have the question and deal with it. I mean, there are some contexts where that might be enough. Like I would say if I was on an NCSY Shabbaton and I would just want to kind of deal with the topic, this would be a great way to engage the kids on the topic. But I think in a classroom, we usually want to go a little bit deeper, which means that right after you kind of get this first layer going, it would be, you have to basically look in the sources and decide, okay, which sources do I want to bring in that will help the students kind of, take this to the next level and have a deeper understanding of where this comes from. So just like we saw at the tabs at the top beforehand, we have the tabs that have sources, right? So it's actually really Darcha makes it really easy, right? So you go to the sources section of the website, you're able to see all the sources on your topic, and then it makes it even easier, instead of easier than you think it would be, right? You don't just have to copy and paste it. We even have all of the source sheets on Sefaria. So if you can see their sources, and I put another arrow here, right? The Sefaria source sheet is accessible from right here. And then you would go into Sefaria and you download it. One second. So you go into Sefaria and the source sheet's totally there. And you can decide there which ones you would like in your sources. And it makes it straight into a Google Doc for you. So you can put it right into, did I put that as a step? I think so. No, I did not.
Okay.
Yeah. So that you can you can upload it into your Google Documents, and you can just choose which sources you want, delete whatever you don't want, put in some questions if you think that would be helpful. But basically you choose whichever of the sources you think will kind of help them create some more depth to the discussion and understand where things are coming from. And, sometimes also this is, the sources, you didn't necessarily put them all down, but you'll see what questions your students have, and you can always, easily bring something up or add it in class.
Right. We should also add, there are even on the site as well, there's all additional sources often in the footnotes. So it's like, also, if you feel like you've exhausted the source on the sites, there's more stuff there, generally speaking.
So, okay. And then we also, the really cool feature of the website is, if you see at the end of every article, there's a little
not every article, but some.
Okay. There's a little box here, and there's a nice infographic that actually kind of goes through the sugya. And I really like these, because this is how I study. So I'm looking at this, I'm like, this is what I would try to make if I was, the teacher. So I think it's very helpful, especially when you're teaching things not on on a kind of lower level, for them to still get a feel of the whole sugya. Right? Because you're not going through all the sources, but it's nice to see this is what the whole structure looks like. And it's also helpful, when you're doing it on a very high level, and this kind of boils it down, and you're able to be like, okay, this is what happened. And then they're able to, tack it back to whatever sources said, whatever.
And the truth is, because we have the in brief section, which really summarizes things very briefly. So even the ones that don't have an infographic, that could be an assignment as well, is to have students build an infographic,
right?
Which could be cool.
Yeah, and just one other thing, I didn't put it down, so I want to say it right now. When we discuss this together, is that when you saw on the tab, there's also a podcast tab, which each article does have a podcast of just someone reading through the article, which as teachers, I think is a very good thing to know about, because there are students who that would really be helpful for them, instead of having to read something or go through, a good way of addressing the topic would be for them to listen. So it's always a really good thing to know that it's there. And I think as a teacher. Okay. Anything to add?
Sounds great. Approach number 2?
Approach number 2. Okay. So approach number 2 is finishing the puzzle. So I think this is kind of a very classic teaching, mode. Here where it's designed mostly for grade 9 students with strong tech skills, or grades 10 to 12. And again, your students, and we should emphasize again, all of these aren't necessarily meant to be used alone, especially because we all know that our classes are rarely only strong or only weak, right? Our classes generally have a variety of different types of learners in them, which means that using these, it's a good way of kind of trying to balance it, is saying, okay, let's start this way, but then we can do a lot more sources, and you can balance that way. So it's always, it's good to have everything, because you can work something out for all your students. So yeah, your learning goals, the students will appreciate how today's halacha is based on early sources, right? So the activity is students will study early sources and use them to answer modern day questions. And learning objectives is students will understand reasons given to why men recite Shiloh and Sani Isha. Right, so here you're going to start off by, as the teacher, not as the student. And you can also have your students do this, but you again have to know your students, and you have to decide when this is the right step for them. I think this is a really great tool for students who are writing projects, right? Because they get all the sources. But in terms of when do you want to expose your students to the whole article, that is, really dependent on what you're doing with your class. But obviously read through the section that you've chosen in the in-depth tab on the website.
I want to share something about that also, because this is important to me. A lot of times in Deracha, we're using classic sources on a topic. Sometimes we have additional sources that we bring to light. But I always say that our big chidush is really educational. So a lot, you can have your own educational viewpoints, of course, but a lot of educational thinking goes into the order and the nature of the presentation of each topic. So oftentimes what happens is a teacher might assume that because they know the topic and they've gone through the sources and they recognize all the sources, that like there's not much to be gained. I think we're trying to model also how you might present some of these things in a classroom in terms of how we're writing the articles. So I think it can be a very useful exercise, even for very knowledgeable teachers sometimes, to read through some of the at least some of the articles.
For sure. Okay, so then you can very easily, this is where I put it in, right? You can export the source sheet from Safaria to Google Docs, right? And then you can choose which early sources you would like to use to develop the topic for your students. And this is great because, again, you know your class, you know if they should have all the sources, you know if they should have some of the sources, but you decide how you want to build it for your class and what they should be exposed to. Yeah, so in here I took a couple of the early sources on the topic, which we've already gone through with Lori, and I just built a small source sheet. And again, there's actually English on the website also, so you can decide. It depends what your class is up to and what they need. It's also, I think, very helpful as, sometimes to let the students know, this is available online in English, and maybe not give them the English, so when they need it, they can, access it on the website, but it's not, they don't use it as kind of a crutch. They use it as a resource when they need it. Right, and so step 4, so write some guided questions to help students learn the sources, and this learning can be done in either as a class or in Chavrutot, and everyone knows their students, and everyone knows what's best for them, and it usually just depends on level and, style of students. Sometimes you do half-half, do Chabura with some of the, when you have a, lower level part of your class, do a Chabura with them and let other students do Chavrutot, but always guided questions are always helpful because it lets students kind of stay on track, and it lets them know what you want from them, so what they need to be looking for. So especially when we were talking about before, early sources can be challenging, especially depending on the exposure that your students have had. And so it really helps them feel like they get a grip on it. It's like, I remember always being frustrated in like seminary when I would be learning the Gemara and then I'd come to Shir and like I would be like totally out in left field in what I understood. And it was like a frustrating experience. So for students, it's really good to, guide them. So when they come back into the class and you're discussing it, they feel like, oh, I actually was on track. And, because I was given a track to be on and I really understand what I was supposed to accomplish. Okay, so and step 5 is so design a question that will engage students and help them develop ideas related to the later sources, right? So as you saw, what we did before is we only addressed the earlier sources. So we were kind of trying to build the kind of backbone of how this all works. But I think the deeper questions when we're discussing this topic, especially, and most, I think, topics in women halacha, are bigger questions that are dealt with much more in achronim and modern sources. So what we want to do is kind of create this backbone for the students to see, okay, this is what we have, and let's see how does this apply to us in our modern day. And Derchet does a great job at bringing both of these sources, but I think doing that cutoff where you let them think, which is what we're doing right now, and try to figure out, okay, if this rubs me the wrong way, like why and how could I understand it? And it could be a very engaging class discussion. And it also just helps them be very invested in the topic and thoughtful about it and, really care about it, right? If you just give them the answer, right, they're not, so it's like, okay, that's interesting, versus if you really make them think and wonder about it and don't let them access it at the beginning. So the question I have here is, what do you think males should have in mind, right, when they say the bracha Shalos and Isha, right? So it's a big question, and I'm sure it's a very, intense class discussion. And then you end off with, right? So I brought Rav Henkin, who Lori brought up in her shir beforehand, right? When he talks about it, which is, I think, a very sensitive way of dealing with the topic. And again, you've read the in-depth part of the discussion. So based on what your students, this is something that you can decide not to prepare right away, so you don't have it to give out. Or you can decide to just, if you have a smart board, just go and access the website, and based on your class discussion, decide which of the achronim you think that your class should be seeing, right? Or you can show them everyone if you would like, but I think it's much more meaningful, even if you're going to show them everyone, to start with the people that they said something similar to, or they, based on what you see from the discussion, they're going to relate to. So, kind of, I think it's important, it's always important to, do all the research on your topic. But I think when you're teaching like this, knowing as much as you can out there, that's there is very helpful, because it means that you could kind of work based off of what your students are thinking about in the discussion. And you don't always know what that is until you start that discussion with them.
What I think is really interesting about what you've suggested here is, obviously teachers give students sources and talk about them all the time. But I think you've modified that kind of like standard practice in a few like really meaningful ways. First of all, taking the time to see, well, what educational approach to Derech take to the sources? Is that going to be useful for me in the classroom? Having a jump start on collecting the sources based on that, limiting it to one topic, like really saying we're going to deal with this issue and we're going to let our students feel they're sinking their teeth into it, but also not giving them everything, giving them that moment where they're generating their own ideas, and then giving them there's something else to hang on to, which I think is also, sometimes it feels like the only things that are solid are the early sources, and then afterwards it's just discussion. There's something really nice about seeing a halachic source that seems to really speak to issues themselves that the students themselves are bringing up. So I think I like all of those aspects of this particular design also.
Okay, let's move on. Right, and so for a homework assignment, just like Lori said, so it was read the relevant part of the article on the Darchat website, write a paragraph summarizing with the article added to what we learned in the class. And I think that in this particular method of teaching, that's actually very meaningful, because you're building layers one at a time, where you start off with a core, and then they try to, generate what they can from that, and then to go back and say, hey, look at this article and see, like, what's the next step that you hadn't thought of, and really, and like giving them that type of homework assignment where they have to figure out what exactly is it that they kind of, not that they missed, but the step they haven't taken yet, and be very read carefully in order to figure that out.
Or also based on what you were saying before, like another aspect of this could be summarize what this added, or if there's something still missing, what's your question?
Right.
Where do you want to go next?
Right. And that's always something I think when you use Darcha, you should have in the back of your pocket, because it's so fun. I've actually done it to the Nishmat website just for fun. When I was running my Bechina, I would just write in questions sometimes, just for fun. But I
might have answered some of those.
Yeah, I'm saying, but like, just, it's a fun thing to do when you are like, when you're learning about something, is to feel like someone's going to answer you, and there's like another piece of the discussion. And it's always the same, whatever article you're looking at, that's, an extra piece. And we like the questions too, and then we get more down on our website.
It's more than that. It's students understanding. I mean, part of the goal of this whole thing is for students to feel they're part of the halachic discussion. That halachic discussion didn't end hundreds of years ago. It's still ongoing, and they're in it. And that, I think that's a great way for that to work. All right, should we move to number 3?
Yes, sure. Let's go here. Good timing. Okay, so number 3. So this is bringing it home. So what we're going to do, and this is, I think, particularly this topic, it can get, very heated, because there are a lot of, as we said, there's a lot of things that really can bother students. So I think in the first 2, approaches, we focused on, okay, how are you going to teach the sources, but not as much how are you going to think about the sources, and how are the students going to process the sources, because I think that's a really hard part about teaching these topics. So we're bringing it home, so students will think about different understandings of the brachot of Shalos and Isha and Shas and Kirtzono. And as you see, by the way, I put class level as 9 to 12, because I really do think that no matter how you're teaching the topic, these things come up, right? It could be that you read a tshuva about it, or it could be that you're learning all the sources, and it could really bother students that they're stuck together with an eved, right? Because that is, it's not exactly comfortable. So I 9 to 12 is anywhere you're teaching at whatever level it's on. I think that it really does need some processing on the student's part. So the activity, the students will learn sources together in class, and then complete a series of assignments, which will help them reflect upon the different facets of the brachot. So the way I kind of thought about this when I was writing it is that you would kind of either start off with reading one of the tshuvot, or start off with some of the sources. And again, your classes, and the right way to do this for your classes. And from there, I designed a few assignments that can help students think about it and process it as a class, and hopefully come out feeling comfortable and good about these brachot. So
Or
students,
at least more comfortable and more good.
Exactly. Thank you. Right. So students will appreciate the multifacetedness of the Torah as exemplified by the different ways of understanding the brachot. It's also part of when you see there's two sides to something, I think it's really important for them to understand it's not just the one you agree with and one you disagree with, but there's truth to everything. And hopefully by kind of entertaining both sides, we have some level of I understand why there are different approaches and different ways of seeing things at different points. So that's what I'm hoping that students would get out of this. So let's start. So we prepare the source study as we saw in the previous section, and you can choose whatever method, right, based on what will work best for your students. And so so prepare the assignments that will help the students take the topics one step further. So we have Shalos Anisha. So the first assignment I have, students will interview their father, brother, or other male about their personal relationship with the bracha of Shalos Anisha. So here are some questions. I think it's important, give your students at least example questions of what to do, right? What they should ask is, what are you thinking about when you say the bracha? How do you feel about the bracha and why? And I think this is a really important one because it really helps them engage in the sources that you looked at in class in a deeper way, which is choose a source that we learned in class to share and discuss with the interviewee, right? So you're bringing Rav Hinke, you're bringing whoever they related to most and bring it into discussion. Don't just, ask questions, also share some Torah, learn about it and see what their reaction is to
because it really reinforces the idea that we're not talking about two separate worlds. There's our emotional world of reaction and there's a halachic world, and they can't converse with each other. It's saying we need to talk and feel in relationship, and as part of a discussion, as part of a dialogue with what these texts have to say.
For sure. And also, not everyone's going to have a great answer that they're going to love. So it's kind of arming them with something to talk about, whether they're just, reinforcing what the person says or trying to really have a deep discussion with someone who said something that kind of, made them uncomfortable. I think is important to go into the question with something like that. Right. So so discussion conclusion from the assignment with your class. So I think it's really important that you should share the interviews in class. And this is because not everyone's interview will probably go well, right? There will be some girls who probably come in and are not so happy with the answers that they got from whoever they were talking to. And so I think it's important for everyone to get the feeling of, okay, there were people, I'm sure, I would really hope that there are some positive interviews. So at least even if someone didn't have a great experience, I think by sharing it, you're actually going to be able to see that, okay, there are people who think this way and come out feeling better about it and getting all perspectives.
I want to add that not everyone listening teaches only girls. And I think it's important to note that it's not always, this is not just a girl's issue, meaning there's a lot of teenage boys and men who have questions about these brachas and what they're supposed to be saying and what it means. And I think it's meaningful also to, if you want to take a young man and suggest to him that he needs to talk to an older man and see what his perspective is, I think that's very enriching. And it, there's a lot of potential there for his growth. And also it's an opportunity for him to talk. Sometimes it's safer for teenagers to talk about what they're feeling when it's part of a conversation where someone else is sharing their thoughts than to just sort of come out with something. So the interview assignment can also be a kind of a safe way to kind of bring some of that out there, I think.
For sure. And honestly, this is a boys' topic rather than a girls' topic, the beginning topic.
Well, it's both.
It is. It's an everybody
topic.
Right. So leading questions for your class, right, which you should always have prepared is, were you happy or disappointed with the results of your interview? Do you feel like sharing the sources you learned in class changed the way your father, brother, or friend thought about the bracha, right? And to really see, how did you engage with the sources? I think that's important to see, did that really affect the person? Did it change the person? And I think it could be a really, really interesting class discussion to see how the different interviews went.
Sounds great.
Okay. Okay, assignment number 2. So Shasani Kirtzono. Okay, so we saw that there are 2 main ways to understand this bracha, right? So we saw acceptance, as Lori said, or resigned acceptance of Hashem's will to exempt women from some mitzvot. This explanation implicitly acknowledges how difficult confronting the exemption might be, or positive recognition, right? A positive recognition of women's creation in the divine image. So students will review the topics by reading the relevant section into Archa's article and writing briefly on which understanding of the bracha they relate to. First of all, I think it's important, especially because I think this is a very deep topic, and I think it is helpful for them to read about it again and get a little bit more information. So I think this is one of those times, and again, you decide if this works for your class, to read it and get, I think you get a little bit more perspective when you read the article, right? It's not just the sources in your discussion in class. You get kind of, there is perspective in there, and to read about that before you kind of do this assignment is helpful and will probably make a much more meaningful assignment. And so basically, and what we're asking them to do is just say which of these approaches works for you.
Yeah, what I think is actually really interesting about it is when I can just speak for myself. When I first started teaching this topic and learning about this topic, it was clear to me that the only thing I was interested in was the second approach. Mm-hmm. And the first approach actually was difficult. It was like, what is this? Like, I'm supposed to be talking to God about how it's a bummer to be female? Like that seemed really rough. And then realizing that, wow, like this is actually a place where you have major halachic authorities, like, for example, the Torah, saying it's hard for women to confront exemptions from certain mitzvot. Like, it's also a space for that is meaningful for me. And I think one of the students might develop other approaches to it that aren't based in sources, and that could be interesting. That's somewhere we're going to go in a minute. But I think it's interesting to talk about, can these things coexist? Is it one or the other?
Right. So, and I think, so one of the things that I actually wrote when you're taking up this kind of assignment, I think it's actually a very good idea for teachers to write this assignment as well, because I do think that students come from a certain place at a certain age, and it's very hard for them to fathom that like life will change and you'll understand things differently. And I think it's really great for like, as a teacher, to model that like, you might have thought like that as well at some point, and then like things did change, and to talk about that, because it's good for them to hear it, because they respect you. Like, you're their halacha teacher, and they see you as someone who is like normal and great and interesting. So like, to understand that like, hey, like you used to think of me, but you kind of shifted the way you thought, and why is meaningful, because they could actually, like, later in their life, when they think back at that, it's very helpful. And I can think of examples from my own life when things that I, couldn't understand at the time when a teacher said it. And then like 10 years later, it's like, oh yeah, like really, this makes sense. And I think that that's like a very crucial piece to this section, because it really does help you. It will help your students, not just in the moment, it will help them gain perspective and understand that like, it's not just the other opinion that we don't like, or we don't really understand. It's their opinions, and sometimes they speak to us at different points in our life, and they're both there for a reason, and different things click at different points, and that's okay. And it's good to have them in the back of your head.
Something that I find particularly meaningful about the way you framed it as well is sometimes in that kind of situation, there's this danger that the teacher's view becomes the view everyone thinks they're supposed to have also, whether they relate to it or not. And I really like the way that Ora framed it, that they're doing the assignment and you're doing the assignment as well. In other words, it's not that, oh, the teacher's saying what she thinks and then she's giving the assignment. No, everyone's doing this assignment and exploring it. People are sharing their views, and the teacher is one of the voices in the classrooms. Of course, the teacher's voice has a special type of a weight, but when the teacher presents her own view as one of the voices in the classroom, as opposed to being, this has to be the be all and end all, especially if the teacher can be, and of course, you have to think developmentally, and you have to think about what's comfortable for you, especially if the teacher can be genuine in an appropriate way. I think that's very meaningful too, because it's the teacher bringing themselves to the table, but really making room for the students and recognizing the students as really as spiritual beings and thinkers working through things.
No, for sure. And I think also just the acknowledge, like, I think also saying that the teachers, it's not that they have the right thing, but like be able to like see a bigger picture, and being able to see that afterwards, it's like, oh, like we all, like there's a good chance that there's a good part of your student, like a good group of your students that have very similar approaches to this, and being able to see like, oh, there is a bigger picture that we really didn't think of, which I really think will happen in a lot of classes, is like so good for them in this situation. Okay. And it's just an important thing in Torah in general to like not to think of, okay, the different opinions all have like real value. I think that it gives that off at the same time. Okay, then we have bracha conclusions, right? So students will write one clear paragraph in answer to the following question, right? We have 3 ways of approaching this specific bracha, right? So we have one is decide not to say it. And by the way, you see these 3 conclusions are at the bottom of the infographic that we saw at the beginning, right? So if you want to start with that, that's a really good way of starting it, where you show here's the development and here are the 3 different kind of conclusions we can come to.
Right, and with Shasani Kirtzono, there really is no halachic obligation to say. Now, if you're your family, if your mother has the minhag that she says it, so you know that obviously has a special weight, but it's not a halachically obligatory bracha.
Exactly. Right. So, and then actively choose what you mean when you say it, or use it as an affirmation of being created as God willed. So the question for the assignment is like one short paragraph is just to say, what are you going to do at this stage in your life and why? And I think it's an important way of ending the class is thinking practically, like, what am I going to do? Right. And also, I mean, I think it's an important discussion also to say, can you just change it? Can you say, forget this, I'm not saying this anymore? Right. I think that's a good discussion you have to have with the class.
Right. So let's say Minhag Chabad, it's very prominent Minhag Chabad not to say it, right? But then, you know, many other Ashkenazi communities, it's what women say. So it's not so simple to just jettison Minhag.
Right. No, for sure.
It's
and I think that's, you know, something that I would even like bring in someone else's opinion when I was talking about it. Because it's not, you know, it's a different, you know, there's, you know, someone who's like a posek in a school or someone you guys that would normally talk to. I would think that would be something, maybe bring them into the class to talk about it. If there is students who you feel like if you get 6 assignments that say, oh, we're not saying this anymore, meaning I actually think it would probably be better to do it beforehand, because to say, oh, you're allowed to not say it anymore and then bring in the opinion. But maybe when you're discussing the options here, to bring in someone to really talk about it and say, you know, can you not, and how that works. I think that's really important. And I think to have that kind of, it's a really good way of just concluding the class and giving you like, okay, now what's the take home, right? It's not just about what you're feeling. It's about, okay, what am I going to do? How does this change the way I say the bracha? So I think it's a very nice way of ending the class and getting all your thoughts together.
I think in honesty, I think like option one, it's like I said, it could be out there. You know, the weight of minhag is significant, so it's not so simple. So I think the idea of bringing someone else in and having that discussion, if you really see it. But I think also if we've done our job right in educating on this topic, my guess is that option one is sort of going to be the kind of thing that like students like, that it's there, but it's not going to be necessarily what they're jumping to do. Because I think they're going to, God willing, they'll be able to see themselves in the options in the ways of understanding it.
Right. But you really never know where a class discussion is going to go.
Also true.
From experience.
I think on the whole, and this is very important and it very much, and then we'll open it up to questions. I see our time is running low. But we can stop the slide share. Get back on the camera, moderator. It might be that we can do it. That sounds excellent. Thank you so much. All of these different approaches and our whole discussion today is predicated on a very, very basic educational approach, which I think is important to put out there. Some of you might be familiar with another Deracha team member, Yotzet Halacha Shana Goldberg's book that she recently put out, What Do You Really Want? Trust and Fear in Decision Making. And really, Deracha's approach in general to sensitive topics, and it's why we have the guts to make this session for educators about this sensitive topic, is an approach of trust. There's an idea that the animating idea here is that Torah is rich. We can approach it, we can learn it, and the learning and approaching and discussing it is ultimately going to help us connect to Torah, find our place in Torah, be committed to observing Torah. So that, you know, these assignments, let's say, you know, I think some people, it would be really almost scary. Like, you're going to let the students talk about Shalos Isha. You're going to make room for the students to weigh in on what they think. I mean, for some of you, it's obvious that you do that. And for others, it might be almost frightening, or even the self-assignment, the idea that you might share what you really think might be complicated for different educators for a range of reasons. And I think what's really animated all of these assignments and what animates the work on Deracha is saying, no, we don't have to be afraid. We can talk about it. We can look at it. And you know what? Not everyone has to love it either. One of the things that this article talks about, it looks very much in the eye, the question of can the bracha of Shelo Asani Isha be changed? And we talk about why that's not something that we can do really at this stage in halacha. And at the same point, like we discuss it because we understand that that's something that's liable to come up for some of the people learning about it, male or female, and that's so that's important. It's important to say we can look these things in the eye, and we can look at the sources and that we have access to, and find others, and we can ask additional questions if we have them, and we don't have to be afraid to talk about it, and we don't all have to think everything is perfect at the end of the day, but that this can be an ongoing process, as Aura was talking about, teachers developing their own ideas through life also. It's going to be an ongoing, nuanced process of learning and discussion.
Sure.
All right. So maybe we'll, I don't know if we have any questions, but we have a little time now for questions if anyone wants to share with us. Yeah, I think that, yes, absolutely. If someone wants to, if of course these are what the lesson plans, these approaches that we put out there are there for you to modify. So if there's something that's uncomfortable, then absolutely, it's got to be what's comfortable for you in your classroom and for your students, and you've got to adjust it appropriately for sure.
Where's the
Is there anything else that someone wants to raise? Okay, so look, this is one topic. It's one example of many topics that can be dealt with similar teaching approaches.
And getting also to know the Derech website, and there's ways to use the Derech website that are, I'm saying, make your life really easy. Instead of having to go look for an interesting tshuva, right? You have your tshuva right there, and you can work backwards with students and find the engaging one very, very easily. And so all the things that we showed you really can work for many of the different, topics on the website.
And I think what we'd really like to invite you to do is, you're educators, and I think we have a lot to learn from you. We hear reports all the time of educators who use their materials in the classroom and have developed their own creative ways of doing it. So these are some suggestions that are coming from us, but the best suggestions and also the best feedback about how to improve what we've got on the site, because it's a website and we can change it and we can make it better. The best ideas are probably going to come from you in the field. So if you have additional ideas, whether they're building on things that were suggested here or from a completely different direction, or if you have other sources or thoughts about where this discussion could go, please share them with us. Okay, thank you so much. I think we're going to end it here. Thank you so much to everyone here. Thank you so much to Chaya, our moderator, as well. It's been great to learn with you.
Here we are.